By the closing months of 1944, the Reich was collapsing from within. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army's relentless advance had torn through Poland and into East Prussia. On the Western Front, Allied forces had crossed into Germany after the failure of Hitler's last gamble, the Ardennes offensive. The once invincible Wehrmacht was fractured, its soldiers starving, its cities burning, and its people running for survival. Amid this chaos, another group moved through the snow and rubble, the women of the Reich. Some wore the gray-blue uniforms of the Luftwaffe's Helferinnen, the female auxiliaries who manned communication lines and anti-aircraft batteries. Others were nurses, secretaries, or volunteers from the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, conscripted into service as the war consumed every remaining able body. They had served in hospitals, supply depots, and command posts. But as the front collapsed, their roles vanished, leaving them stranded between retreating German troops and advancing Allied armies. When the Eastern Front disintegrated, hundreds of thousands of civilians fled westward, a desperate exodus through blizzards and artillery fire. Among them were countless women, many pregnant, some pushing makeshift carts with infants, others carrying nothing but hope that surrender to the Western Allies would mean survival. But surrender didn't always lead to freedom. As Soviet and Allied troops swept through villages and towns, thousands of German women were rounded up, not as civilians, but as prisoners of war. Many had worked in military-related roles, making them legitimate POWs under Allied command. Others were taken simply because they were German and in uniform, even if their only weapon had been a typewriter or bandage roll. In Soviet-occupied territories, the treatment of these prisoners varied drastically. Some were marched eastward in brutal columns, part of the mass deportations that would fill labor camps deep inside the USSR. Others were held in temporary detention centers in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, facilities hastily converted from barracks or factories. The women endured freezing conditions, scarce food, and the terror of not knowing whether they would ever see home again. Pregnancy in such places was both a curse and a lifeline. A curse because food rations were meager, diseases spread easily, and medical care was almost non-existent. A lifeline because sometimes even the harshest guards hesitated before cruelty when a crying infant was involved. In the West, the picture was different but not entirely merciful. British and American forces, guided by the Geneva Convention, classified captured female auxiliaries as POWs with basic rights to food, shelter, and medical attention. But their conditions were still harsh. Overcrowded camps, poor sanitation, and emotional trauma from propaganda-fed guilt. Some women were interrogated for intelligence. Others were kept in service to clear rubble or aid in reconstruction efforts. By 1945, it was estimated that nearly 500,000 German women were in Allied custody, some official prisoners, others displaced or interned in controlled zones. They represented every class of wartime Germany, from Berlin secretaries to farm girls from Silesia. A handful were nurses who had stayed behind to care for wounded soldiers, captured when hospitals were overrun. A few were Luftwaffe radio operators, accused of relaying enemy signals. And some, though civilians, were simply swept into the chaos of surrender. For those expecting children, the ordeal was particularly cruel. There were no maternity wards, no midwives, no clean sheets. Women gave birth in cold wooden barracks, their cries drowned out by the howling wind. Infants born in captivity often didn't survive the first weeks. Malnutrition, infections, and exposure claimed many lives. And yet, there were moments of quiet defiance. In the same barracks where despair lingered, the women shared what little they had: scraps of bread, old cloths torn into diapers, whispered songs from a world they no longer recognized. It was an act of survival and humanity that endured even when nations crumbled. By the beginning of 1945, word began to spread across Allied camps. Some captors, particularly Soviet nurses and officers, had begun providing medical help to pregnant German prisoners. Not out of sympathy for their cause, but from something older, deeper, a recognition of shared suffering. The kind that transcended uniforms. In that winter of defeat, when the Third Reich's banners burned and its ideology lay in ruins, These women became the forgotten face of surrender, enemies not by hatred but by circumstance. Their journey from power to powerlessness, from serving a regime to begging for a child's survival, revealed the most fragile truth of war. It consumes everything, even innocence, and yet somehow, humanity still finds a way to breathe beneath the ash. By early 1945, millions of German prisoners were scattered across Europe. The men filled barbed wire compounds in France, Britain, and the Soviet Union. But the women were fewer, and their presence in captivity unsettled even their captors. Female POWs were not a familiar sight in the first half of the war. Germany had rarely sent women into frontline service. Their tasks were administrative, medical, or logistical. Yet as the conflict devoured manpower, the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and SS increasingly relied on them. When defeat came, so did confusion. How should the victors treat these women who had worn the enemy's uniform but never held a rifle? The answer depended on where they fell. In the camps run by the British, Americans, and French, classification mattered. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were entitled to humane treatment, medical care, and correspondence with their families. But the convention had been written with male combatants in mind. It said little about expectant mothers or infants born in captivity. Still, the Western Allies generally followed procedure. Female auxiliaries, particularly from the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht, were registered, issued identification cards, and separated from male prisoners. They were given food, often little more than watery soup and bread, and medical inspections by camp doctors. For those pregnant or nursing, arrangements varied. In Britain and France, some were transferred to civilian hospitals under guard. In U.S.-controlled camps in Germany, the U.S. Army Medical Corps occasionally provided milk and vitamins when supplies allowed, but life remained bleak. Letters were censored. News from home was scarce. Many of the women carried a double burden, the shame of defeat and the uncertainty of motherhood under occupation. Some American officers witnessing the births in captivity wrote in their diaries about the strange duality. Yesterday's enemy becomes today's patient. The child does not yet know what side he's born on. In the East, the situation was far more brutal. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, oversaw the internment of German POWs and civilian workers. The camps, often in former industrial sites or repurposed barracks, were overcrowded and undersupplied. Food rations were minimal, 400 to 600 calories per day, and disease spread rapidly. For female prisoners, pregnancy could mean a death sentence. Some gave birth on straw floors without medical help. Others hid their condition out of fear of retaliation or assault. Infant mortality was staggering, and yet amid this horror there were exceptions. Quiet moments that defied the pattern. Soviet nurses, many of whom had lost their own families to the war, sometimes smuggled food or medicine to German mothers. A few commanders allowed milk to be distributed to newborns, recorded in Red Cross and Soviet archives alike. It wasn't policy. It was humanity breaking through exhaustion and revenge. One Soviet doctor, Dr. Maria Oglobina, later wrote in her post-war memoirs, "I could not hate a child. The mother was my enemy, but the infant was simply alive. That was enough." Such accounts were rare, but they existed. Threads of compassion woven into a fabric of suffering. Both sides understood the symbolic power of mercy. For the Soviets, showing leniency toward pregnant POWs served a quiet propaganda purpose, to contrast their justice with the atrocities committed by the Nazis in occupied territories. For the Western Allies, humane treatment of German women reinforced their adherence to international law and moral superiority. But for the women themselves, none of it felt political. They weren't symbols, they were survivors. Every warm meal, every clean bandage, every cup of milk meant another day their child might live. In some camps, Red Cross delegates noted the anomaly. Infants born to German POW mothers receiving special rations, milk, sugar, even soap. Reports from camps in Tambov, USSR, and Cherbourg, France, mentioned medical exceptions granted for expectant women. The word exception tells the whole story. Compassion was not the rule, but the rebellion against it. For the first time in modern warfare, women found themselves prisoners on such a scale. Their captors often didn't know how to handle them. Were they soldiers, victims, collaborators, Some were interrogated harshly, accused of Nazi sympathy. Others were treated as helpless civilians. This confusion shaped every decision made about their care. What made their situation extraordinary was not only their vulnerability, but the contrast between expectation and reality. Most had been raised to believe that capture by the Soviets meant certain death. Stories of atrocities had circulated for months. Yet some awoke to find milk delivered for their newborns. It was bewildering, disorienting, and unforgettable. That shock, the moment when fear met unexpected kindness, would linger for the rest of their lives. For the women, it was proof that even in victory, not every soldier sought vengeance. And for history, it marked the beginning of one of the quietest, least known acts of mercy in the Second World War. Because soon, these isolated gestures, the milk, the medicine, the helping hands would spread across camps from Poland to the Urals. And with them came something no one had expected to survive 1945. Empathy. Behind every barbed wire fence, war lost its flags. In captivity there were no uniforms of glory, only hunger, sickness, and silence. For the German women who found themselves prisoners, that silence was heavier than chains. They had lived through years of total war, a society built on certainty and superiority. Propaganda had promised them safety behind the front lines, and loyalty to the Führer had been taught as salvation. But when the Reich fell, their world crumbled. They were no longer the daughters of a proud empire. They were the defeated, the forgotten, and for many mothers in the most hopeless of circumstances. In the early weeks of captivity, fear was constant. Every sound beyond the fence, boots, engines, barking dogs, meant danger. The women didn't know what to expect from their captors. They had heard the stories: Red Army revenge, Allied interrogation, starvation. For many, the first days were filled with trembling silence, holding their swollen bellies, whispering to unborn children that they would somehow survive. Those who gave birth inside the camps often did so alone or with the help of other prisoners. Sometimes a nurse among them would step forward, using strips of old cloth and melted snow to clean wounds. These makeshift midwives risked punishment for breaking camp rules, but they did it anyway, because to do nothing was worse. Each birth in the camps was a defiance of war itself. A child's cry against the death that surrounded them, the women formed silent networks of care, fragile yet powerful. They shared food, clothes, stories, even dreams. Those who were stronger carried water for those who couldn't stand. Those without children watched over the newborns when mothers collapsed from exhaustion. In one Soviet camp near Minsk, a survivor later recalled, "We had nothing but ourselves. When a baby was born, every woman gave something: a piece of cloth, a crust of bread, a prayer. We became mothers to each other's children." In that harsh world, solidarity replaced ideology. There were no Nazis or communists anymore, no propaganda or pride, only women trying to keep each other alive. It was humanity stripped down to its core. When the first Soviet nurses and guards began bringing milk and medicine, disbelief spread faster than hope. The women didn't trust it at first. They thought it was a trick or mockery. For years they had been taught to fear the Soviets as monsters, destroyers, subhuman enemies. But then they saw a Russian nurse cradle a German baby, gently feeding it from a tin bottle. And something inside them broke. Not in despair, but in awakening. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It wasn't peace. But it was the beginning of remembering what it meant to be human. The same scene repeated across camps in Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. A guard handing over a loaf of bread to a mother. A Soviet doctor disinfecting a wound. A child being wrapped in a clean blanket scavenged from medical stores. Small gestures. Yet in those moments they meant more than victory or ideology. They meant survival. For the women, the emotional impact was lasting. Even decades later, in memoirs and interviews recorded by German historians, the memory of that first act of mercy often brought tears. Many of them had lost faith in everything: their country, their beliefs, their God. But they remembered the milk. They remembered the warmth of a stranger's hands. In post-war testimonies, phrases like, "They could have let my child die," but they didn't, appear again and again. To those who had known only hatred, the realization that compassion could come from the enemy was incomprehensible. It reshaped their understanding of what war had tried to destroy. empathy, dignity, and the fragile bond between human beings. The babies born behind wire were called Lagerkinder, camp children. Some survived, some didn't. Those who lived carried no memory of their birthplace, but their mothers never forgot. They were the living proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, life refused to surrender. When the camps were finally disbanded, these children left with their mothers. Many carried home in rags wrapped against the cold. Some grew up in post-war Germany unaware that they had been born in captivity, their existence hidden out of shame. Others later discovered their origin through old documents or whispered family stories. For their mothers, those children were not reminders of suffering, but of endurance. Each breath their child took was proof that compassion, however rare, had triumphed over hatred, if only for a moment. The emotional angle of this story lies in that paradox, the collision between cruelty and kindness. The same war that burned cities and buried millions also created moments where enemies saved each other. It's difficult to reconcile, but it happened, and it mattered. The women who lived through it often spoke not of revenge or politics, but of the faces they remembered. The guard who turned away so they could smuggle food. The Soviet nurse who smiled while handing them medicine. The child who survived against all odds. In those fragments, history reveals something larger than the war itself, the endurance of mercy in a world built to destroy it. And as their stories would later show, those fragile acts of compassion would ripple far beyond the fences, shaping how nations remembered, how veterans reconciled, and how humanity slowly learned to heal. While the human stories unfolded quietly within the camps far beyond the fences, another struggle was taking shape, a moral and political contest over how the victors would define themselves. The war was ending, but the narrative of the war was just beginning. And in that narrative, the treatment of prisoners, even of pregnant German women, carried enormous symbolic weight. In 1945, Europe was not only a battlefield, it was a theater of ideology. Both the Western Allies and the Soviet Union knew that how they treated their captives would shape how history remembered them. For the United States and Britain, mercy was a statement of principle. The world had witnessed the horrors of the concentration camps. The Allies sought to stand on moral ground untainted by revenge. Every act of medical care, every loaf of bread given to a prisoner was part of a broader message: we are not them. British Red Cross reports and American military correspondences from the spring of 1945 reflected this tone. Officers were instructed to follow the Geneva Convention closely, especially with female and medical personnel. Pregnant prisoners, though rare, were to be treated with all consideration possible within logistical limits. Such phrasing hid the harsh reality of shortages, but it still marked an official intent: compassion as policy. The Soviets, however, faced a moral dilemma of a different kind. They had lost over 20 million lives. Entire cities had been razed. Villages erased, families destroyed. For many soldiers, mercy toward Germans felt almost unnatural. And yet, from the highest levels of command, the Soviet Union sought to prove something beyond vengeance: that it was a civilized victor. The Kremlin's propaganda machine understood the international gaze. Images of Soviet doctors tending to German POWs, especially women and children, appeared in domestic publications and later in controlled foreign press. It was both real and strategic, genuine acts of compassion but also tools of reputation. Mercy in 1945 was not only an emotion, it was a political weapon. Compassion also had practical consequences. By treating POWs, especially women, with some degree of care, the Allies reduced the likelihood of rebellion, despair, and disease outbreaks that could spread to guards and nearby civilians. Medical treatment wasn't purely altruistic, it was also tactical hygiene. In the Western camps, records from the U.S. Army's Prisoner of War Command show that pregnant women were provided small privileges: cleaner quarters, blankets, and reduced labor duties. A healthy prisoner was easier to manage than a dying one. A fed child posed less of a threat than a starving crowd. In the East, similar reasoning appeared in scattered Soviet reports. Camp administrators who ensured minimal medical aid to mothers often reported higher productivity among their labor units. A surviving workforce was an effective one. In this sense, the milk and medicine given to POW infants served two masters: humanity and logistics. But for the women receiving it, the reason mattered little. Intent was invisible. All they saw was the act itself. A bottle in the snow, a doctor's quiet nod, a gesture that meant their child might live another day. After the guns fell silent, Europe faced an uncomfortable question. Can morality exist in war without motive? Were these acts of mercy genuine compassion or calculated politics? Historians continue to debate this. The moral ambiguity of mercy in war lies in its coexistence with suffering. A single gesture of kindness could never erase the brutality surrounding it, yet it still mattered profoundly to those who received it. In the eyes of international law, the humane treatment of POWs was an obligation, not an option. But in the eyes of history, how it was interpreted became part of the ideological struggle that defined the early Cold War. For the Soviet Union, stories of merciful treatment reinforced its claim as a liberator, not a destroyer. For the Western Allies, adherence to humane standards justified their vision of a new, lawful world order, one that would soon give birth to the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And yet, for the women who lived through it, none of this was theoretical. Politics faded in the face of childbirth. Ideology dissolved in the presence of hunger. The morality they witnessed was personal, not strategic. The political and moral dimensions of these events reveal something fundamental about the psychology of victory. When the fighting ends, nations seek to redefine themselves not by the destruction they caused, but by the mercy they showed afterward. For the Allies, this was a moment of self-reflection. Could they claim moral superiority if they mirrored the cruelty they had fought to defeat? The answer, though uneven, was found in moments like these. A Russian medic offering care to a German woman, a British doctor ensuring milk rations for a newborn in a camp near Cherbourg. These small acts became the quiet proof of civilization's endurance. They showed that humanity could survive even in systems built for dehumanization. In later decades, declassified reports and oral histories would confirm what many suspected. These acts of kindness were often unofficial, carried out by individuals who disobeyed indifference. The state didn't instruct them to feel compassion. They simply did. And perhaps that is what gives the story its true moral weight, that mercy in the end did not come from policy or propaganda, but from human conscience. From soldiers and nurses who had seen too much death and chose, for once, to preserve life. As spring 1945 approached and Germany's defeat became certain, those quiet acts of compassion began to multiply, spreading from one camp to another like small sparks in the dark. And soon, they would culminate in something even more remarkable, a series of moments when the supposed enemies of the Reich, Soviet and Allied guards alike, became protectors of the most fragile lives born out of its collapse. It began quietly. Not as a command, not as an order from above, but as a whisper between barracks. A story that seemed almost impossible to believe. Winter, 1945. The war was collapsing into chaos. Across Eastern Europe, snow buried the ruins of cities, and the front lines were dissolving into scattered columns of prisoners and refugees. Inside the barbed enclosures of captured German personnel, the atmosphere was thick with despair. The women were starving, sick, and terrified, and then something different happened. One of the earliest documented acts occurred in February 1945, in a Soviet-run camp near Lublin, Poland. The camp held roughly 2,000 German prisoners, soldiers, nurses, and civilian auxiliaries. Among them were several pregnant women captured during the Red Army's push westward. According to post-war testimonies compiled by the German Red Cross Search Service, a Soviet field medic named Irina Petrovna discovered one of the women. A 23-year-old former Luftwaffe telephonist named Elizabeth Kruger, in labor on the barracks floor. No bedding, no sanitation, only snow melting through the cracks of the roof. Petrovna could have walked away. She didn't. Using her own medical kit, she cut the umbilical cord, sterilized it with vodka, and wrapped the newborn in her army scarf. Later that day, a Red Army driver returned from a nearby village carrying 2 bottles of milk and a small tin of sugar. The next morning, the camp's women gathered silently as Elizabeth wept. not from pain, but from disbelief. Her child had lived, and the milk had come from the enemy. Word spread quickly, carried by letters, rumors, and the traveling Red Cross. In a British-controlled POW enclosure near Cherbourg, France, similar reports emerged weeks later. Female prisoners from the Kriegsmarine Auxiliary Service were held there, many captured in Brittany after Germany's retreat. British camp doctors recorded several cases of childbirth under supervision, noting in one report, infants born to the prisoners were provided supplementary rations of milk. The mothers were afforded rest from work detail. Conduct in camp markedly improved thereafter. This was not sentimentality. It was pragmatism wrapped in compassion. Yet for the women, it felt miraculous. One survivor later recalled, "They had bombed our cities and we had served the Reich that bombed theirs. But when they handed me milk for my baby, I forgot who had started the war." On the Eastern Front, the situation was harsher, but even there, humanity appeared in flashes. In a former sugar factory outside Bydgoszcz, Poland, converted into a temporary NKVD holding camp, several women from the German Fourth Army were detained. The Soviet officer in charge, Captain Alexei Bondarenko, faced a choice when he discovered two of the prisoners heavily pregnant. Food was scarce and orders from Moscow were unambiguous. All resources were to be prioritized for frontline troops. Bondarenko disobeyed. He diverted part of his unit's rations, condensed milk and bread, to the women. When questioned by superiors, he simply replied, "A child is not my enemy." The small act never made it into official Soviet records. But survivors later told their stories to German historians in the 1960s, describing how Soviet guards occasionally looked away as they traded small items, cloth, soap, even cigarettes, for the sake of the newborns. This was the unspoken truce of the camps, not a treaty signed on paper, but one written in human decency. As the front line stabilized and the Allies began coordinating post-war responsibilities, the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, attempted to document and assist the treatment of German prisoners, including women and their infants. In March 1945, ICRC representatives visiting camps in Nancy, France, and Bari, Italy, noted unusual cases of pregnant POWs being allowed rest, medical attendance, and even additional nutrition. The ICRC report filed in Geneva later that year read, "In several detention facilities, the humanitarian instincts of local commanders have exceeded the minimum requirements. Notably, women with child have been afforded supplies of milk and vitamins at times sourced from the civilian population." The words were restrained, bureaucratic, but behind them was a quiet revolution of conscience. Even as Germany's crimes were being revealed in full, the camps, the killings, the unimaginable, the victors were proving that mercy did not have to die with war. In every camp where milk was given, something shifted. The atmosphere softened. Guards who had once spoken only in commands began to exchange small courtesies. The prisoners, long reduced to silence, began to smile again, faintly, cautiously. No one forgot who they were or what had been lost. But for a fleeting moment, hatred loosened its grip. The mothers sang lullabies in their native German, songs about spring and home. And the guards, though they couldn't understand the words, didn't stop them. Some even listened. The children born in those weeks became symbols without knowing it. To the women, they were life reclaiming its place amid ruin. To the guards, they were a strange reminder of what they had fought to defend. Not a system, but existence itself. By April 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed entirely, thousands of German POWs were scattered across territories now run by Allied command. The milk and medicine distributed to mothers were still exceptions, not rules, but they revealed something profound. When ideology began to fade, instinct returned. The instinct to protect, to heal, to see beyond the uniform. These were not grand gestures. They did not end the war, nor erase the suffering it had caused, but they changed the moral temperature of the world just enough, proof that even after 6 years of inhumanity, something in humanity refused to die. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because as spring turned to summer, those isolated moments of compassion would begin to multiply. Across camps, across continents, until they formed a pattern history could no longer ignore. By May 1945, the guns had fallen silent. The Reich was gone, crushed beneath the weight of its own ambition. But the war's residue lingered everywhere: hunger, disease, displacement. And inside the Allied camps holding millions of German POWs, survival became a new kind of battle. What began as isolated acts of kindness in the final months of the war now started to take shape as something larger, a deliberate, humane policy. The milk, the medicine, the doctors, they were no longer accidents of mercy. They were signs of an awakening. In the American-occupied zones, command structures quickly evolved from wartime custody to post-war reconstruction. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, overseeing the massive POW network, had initially authorized strict rationing and limited aid. But by June 1945, directives from Washington began to emphasize humane standards, especially for vulnerable groups like women and children. At Camp Bad Aibling in Bavaria, U.S. medical officers recorded the arrival of over 200 female prisoners, 20 of whom were pregnant. The camp's physician, Captain Robert L. Anderson, wrote in his log, "There is a unique moral responsibility attached to caring for those who once served the enemy, but now bear life within them. A mother in labor is not a combatant." Nurses, both German and American, began working side by side. Small wards were improvised in wooden huts. Supplies came from army stores and local civilians. The word prisoner began to fade into the background, replaced by something far more basic: patient, woman, mother. Across the Channel, British POW camps had begun adopting similar measures. In Rheinberg and Featherstone Park, the British Army converted sections of their facilities into maternity quarters. Reports from the War Office in London, dated July 1945, confirmed the shipment of condensed milk, iron supplements, and vitamins specifically for German mothers and infants held in custody. Major Eric Morton, one of the medical officers, later explained his reasoning. "We had seen what hate could do. Feeding a child was our way of undoing a small part of it." Inside those camps, the atmosphere was surreal. Women who had served under the Nazi eagle now received milk stamped with the Union Jack. Guards who had fought in Normandy now sterilized bottles for the children of their former enemies. It was the quietest of reconciliations, made not in diplomacy but in humanity. The Soviet zones, however, remained a paradox. Brutality was common, vengeance was sanctioned, and conditions were often lethal. Yet, amid that vast machinery of retribution, moments of compassion still pierced through. In Krasnogorsk Camp No. 27 near Moscow, Soviet doctors caring for German officers also treated several pregnant women transferred from frontline holding sites. One nurse, Anna Mikhailovna, recalled in a 1980 interview, "We had nothing to give. But when one of the German women went into labor, the commander sent a soldier on a horse to get goat's milk from the nearby village. He said even an enemy child must not die of thirst." It was not policy. It was conscience, surfacing in the unlikeliest of places. Such acts didn't erase the cruelty surrounding them, but they revealed something deeper. That even under Stalin's iron command, individual soldiers could still choose compassion, quietly, dangerously, at personal risk. As weeks passed, these humanitarian gestures began to alter the psyche of both prisoners and captors. The hatred that had fueled years of killing began to lose its urgency. In French-administered camps, reports from the Red Cross delegate Roger Cardot describe a noticeable change in morale after milk and medical aid were introduced for mothers. Guards noted fewer escape attempts, calmer behavior, even cooperation during work details. One German mother later wrote in her diary, preserved in the archives of Koblenz, "They gave us milk again today. The child's breath is steady. I thought I would never feel peace again, but for one moment I did." This quiet transformation was not sentimental. It was strategic and moral at once. The Allies understood that rebuilding Europe required more than punishing the guilty. It required teaching mercy to the broken. By late summer 1945, the International Committee of the Red Cross expanded its operations across Europe, coordinating food deliveries, baby formula, and midwife assistance to POW facilities in both Western and neutral countries. In Switzerland, neutral observers helped establish correspondence systems that allowed German mothers in captivity to send word of their infants to relatives in occupied Germany. Packages began to arrive: baby clothes, soap, sometimes even chocolate. A fragile web of compassion began to stitch Europe back together, letter by letter, child by child. The war had ended in ruins, but within those ruins, humanity had found a way to whisper back, "We are still here." For the guards, distributing milk was not an act of charity. It was a symbol, a restoration of order in a moral universe that had lost all gravity. For the mothers, it was salvation. The white liquid that once symbolized domestic life, home, nourishment. Innocence became the one bridge between enemy and human being. No propaganda could have achieved what a single act of kindness did. It began dismantling the emotional architecture of hate. And in that slow, unspoken change, the world began to heal. By autumn 1945, across the shattered landscape of Europe, the image was the same in 100 different places. A German woman cradling her newborn, a guard standing silently nearby, and beside them, a bottle of milk. It was a scene that could have belonged to any side in any war at any time. But in that year, it belonged to a world trying desperately to remember what humanity meant. The turning point was complete. From hatred to compassion, from command to conscience, from death to life. But as the months turned into years, these small acts of mercy would ripple far beyond the fences, into post-war policy, international law, and the rebuilding of Europe itself. The war was over, but peace had not yet learned how to breathe. Europe in 1946 was a continent of ghosts, bombed cities, missing sons, and millions of displaced souls wandering through the wreckage of history. Among them were thousands of women once labeled as enemies, German prisoners of war, now mothers nursing infants born behind barbed wire. The milk and medicine that had sustained them were only the beginning. The true struggle had just begun. In the summer of 1946, Allied authorities began releasing female POWs in gradual waves. Those who had given birth in captivity faced a cruel paradox: freedom without a home. Germany itself was in ruins. Houses flattened, families dead or scattered, infrastructure gone. The returning women often carried infants fathered by unknown soldiers, prisoners, or even guards. Some were rejected by their own communities, symbols of shame, reminders of surrender. In Bavaria and Saxony, local councils recorded the arrival of dozens of mothers returning from Soviet and American camps. They came thin, barefoot, and silent, each with a newborn clutched against her chest. One German mayor, in a letter preserved in the Munich State Archives, wrote, "They came to us from the camps bearing children of no certain paternity. We did not know what to call them. We simply called them life. For many of those children, the story of their birth was buried in secrecy. Camp records were inconsistent, and many women refused to speak of the circumstances that led to their pregnancies, whether they were conceived before capture or during captivity." By 1947, the German Red Cross Search Bureau had documented over 900 cases of infants born in Allied or Soviet camps. Only a fraction were officially registered. Many vanished into orphanages, their origins erased by shame or bureaucracy. One of them, later identified as Karen Lentz, born in a British POW camp in Osnabrück, discovered her story decades later in 1982. Her mother's diary described the moment milk was given to her in captivity. "The only kindness I knew that year." Karen would later write, "I was born in a war that had already ended, but its shadow covered my first breath." Within the Allied command, the presence of children inside POW camps had created both logistical and moral dilemmas. Should they be treated as dependents of enemy personnel, or as innocent civilians? By late 1946, policy began to clarify. In the American and British zones, infants were officially categorized as non-combatant minors, entitling them to medical care and eventual repatriation with their mothers. In contrast, the Soviet command maintained stricter custody, often separating women and children during transfers. Reports from the ICRC's 1947 Geneva Review describe mixed results. In certain Soviet-administered camps, humanitarian efforts were evident. Milk distribution continued intermittently, yet infant mortality remained high due to shortage of antibiotics and poor sanitation. Still, the very fact that milk and medicine were provided at all marked a radical departure from the vengeance many had expected. The world was learning, painfully, that mercy could not be selective. By 1948, when most German POWs had finally been released, hundreds of children born in captivity had already died. Malnutrition, cold infection, no flags, no graves, no records. But those who survived became silent witnesses to one of the most complex moral legacies of the Second World War, the moment when victors showed compassion to the defeated, not because they deserved it, but because they needed it. A historian from the University of Bonn, writing decades later, summarized it best. When the Allies gave milk to their enemies' children, they did more than feed bodies. They fed the idea that civilization still existed. In the years that followed, these forgotten children grew up in a divided Germany, half under democracy, half under dictatorship, and carrying within them the invisible history of both cruelty and kindness. They were the living aftermath of a moral experiment that had begun with a single bottle of milk, but the story didn't end with their release. As the new Europe rose from the ruins, those quiet acts of compassion began to ripple outward, shaping laws, aid programs, and the very principles of humanitarian conduct in future wars. The milk and medicine given to German POW mothers had begun as isolated, almost accidental gestures, fragments of decency in a collapsing world. But by the end of the 1940s, those gestures had evolved into something greater, a foundation for a new moral order. The victors of the most destructive war in history had faced a question no army manual had prepared them for. What does it mean to be human after all this? In 1949, only 4 years after the war's end, the world's nations gathered in Geneva to rewrite the rules of war. The Fourth Geneva Convention, born directly from the moral chaos of the Second World War, included for the first time a specific focus on the protection of civilians and prisoners, with detailed articles on women and children. Article 16 declared, "Expectant mothers and mothers of young children shall be the object of particular protection and respect." The phrasing was simple, but its roots ran deep, reaching back to those forgotten camps where Allied and Soviet medics had handed milk to women once branded as the enemy. The message was unmistakable. Mercy was no longer optional. It was now international law. The International Committee of the Red Cross, which had documented these early acts of compassion, became instrumental in shaping post-war humanitarian doctrine. Their field reports, filled with quiet stories of nurses aiding prisoners and soldiers defying orders to save infants, became moral evidence that even amid total war, humanity could still prevail. By 1950, the ICRC's training manuals for camp administrators specifically referenced the moral responsibility toward pregnant and nursing women, citing examples from Allied post-war camps in Germany, France, and Italy. The milk given to enemy infants had become more than a symbol. It had become precedent. The same spirit extended into the creation of new organizations and initiatives. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, and later UNICEF, founded in 1946, drew heavily on post-war experiences with displaced families, especially those from former enemy nations. UNICEF's first mass aid project, milk powder and medical supplies for European children, including German and Austrian civilians still recovering from famine and disease. For the first time in history, aid did not depend on which side one had fought for. It depended only on need. This reversal of logic, compassion before politics, was revolutionary. And it was born quietly in those prison camps where guards once knelt beside enemy mothers and poured milk into tin cups. By the 1950s, as the Cold War divided the world again, those stories of compassion faded into archives and whispers. The newborns of 1945 were now children starting school in a split Germany, one side taught to distrust the West, the other to fear the East. Few knew that their existence had once united enemies. If only for a moment, historians who later revisited those events found a pattern repeating across conflicts that followed: Korea, Vietnam, the Balkans. Wherever soldiers remembered the stories of their fathers and grandfathers, small acts of mercy persisted: food for enemy civilians, medicine for the captured, protection for mothers. The lesson of 1945 had not been forgotten, even if it was rarely spoken aloud. When post-war Europe began to heal, brick by brick, law by law, the concept of shared humanity became one of its unspoken cornerstones. Germany itself, rebuilt and re-educated, later adopted strict humanitarian standards for its own military under NATO and the Bundeswehr Charter. The very nation that had once dehumanized others now swore to never forget what mercy from its enemies had looked like. The milk in those prison bottles had become a quiet teacher, one that spoke not of victory, but of redemption. The aftermath of the war did not end with treaties or tribunals. It ended in the hearts of people who realized that compassion was not weakness, but civilization's last defense. Because in the ashes of 1945, as mothers held their children under foreign skies, the world glimpsed something extraordinary, that even after the darkest war, humanity could still choose to be kind, and that revelation, that mercy could survive even total war, would echo through every humanitarian effort that followed, shaping the world we live in today. Snow falls slowly over the ruins of Europe. The guns have long fallen silent, the flags replaced, the graves grown over with grass. And yet, and in the quiet of memory, one image endures: a camp. A woman once called the enemy. A guard handing her a small bottle of milk. It is a moment without speeches or banners, without triumph or defeat. It is simply human. History often remembers the loudest things, the battles, the leaders, the destruction. But the truth of a civilization lies in its silences, in the quiet decisions people make when no one is watching. When a Soviet nurse risked punishment to save a German infant, when a British medic poured milk for a mother who once served the Reich, when an American captain wrote that a mother in labor is not a combatant, these were not footnotes. They were the beginning of a new moral era, because mercy, when given to one's enemy, is not a gesture of forgiveness. It is a declaration that humanity still exists, even after everything else has been stripped away. The German POW mothers did not ask for compassion. They simply received it. And in that exchange, milk for gratitude, survival for surrender, the victors proved that strength was not in domination, but in restraint. Their children, scattered across the post-war world, carried no guilt, no pride, only life. They were living proof that the future could be gentler than the past. Today, the echoes of that small kindness still ripple quietly through time. In every humanitarian law, every relief effort, every act of compassion shown to those once called the enemy. It reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity is never completely lost. It hides, waiting for someone to choose it again, and perhaps that is what the milk truly symbolized. Not nourishment for the body, but for the soul of a wounded world. A reminder that the greatest victory in war is not survival, but the decision to remain human.